What if the most detailed description of who Jesus really is was etched into ancient parchment more than 100 years before he ever walked the dusty roads of Galilee, and the church quietly locked that page away for 17 centuries? Do me one thing before we go any further. Hit the like button, drop a hard subscribe, and send this to a friend who is not afraid of hard questions. Because what you are about to hear has been buried for longer than your country has existed. For more than 15 centuries, a small circle of monks has stood watch over a single stone chapel in the highlands of Axum, Ethiopia. Their grandfather's grandfather's grandfather did the same duty, in the same robes, holding the same rope. The chapel is holy. The reason has never shifted. Inside it rests a text the Western Church deliberately erased from public memory. It is called the Book of Enoch. It was struck from the approved list of scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 AD, decided on a single afternoon, and stamped with the verdict, dangerous, unsuitable, gone. Generations of believers never knew it existed. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, and 11 separate copies of Enoch came out of those desert caves, dragged into the open air by Bedouin shepherds, who had no idea what they had stumbled across. 11 copies, more than most of the books that still sit comfortably in your Bible today. That single archaeological fact should have rewritten the conversation across every theological seminary on the planet, but the specific reason this text was buried in the first place is what changes the most. Because the Book of Enoch, written at least 200 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, contains a detailed page after page portrait of a divine figure it calls the Son of Man. He is given a name, he is given a throne, he is given authority over the living and the dead before the foundation of the world. And what Enoch says about him does not match what the Western Church has taught for 17 centuries. What we are going to do today is walk through the specific passages, the scholars who spent their careers on them, the timeline the evidence actually supports, and what the text says on its own terms when you read it without the inherited filter. The text we are dealing with lies in what scholars call the Parables of Enoch, chapters 37 through 71. This is the section of the book that has drawn the most academic fire and the least public attention. The oldest Aramaic fragments from Qumran, catalogued 4Q201 through 4Q204, cover many of the older sections of Enoch, but the parables themselves almost never show up in Aramaic at the caves. The full text survives today only in the Ethiopian Jay's tradition, preserved at Axum under armed guard and later translated into English by R.H. Charles in 1906, then again by Ephraim Isaac in 1983. So a modern reader usually meets this text through a translation made many centuries after the Aramaic originals disappeared into the sand. That single fact, that the parables survive only in Ge'ez, is exactly why they have been skipped for so long. Most Western scholars read Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek as a professional reflex. Ge'ez is a beautiful language with deep roots, but it has a much smaller academic readership. An Ethiopian church tradition was long dismissed as too remote to matter to the serious study of the Western canon, which left the parables guarding themselves in silence for generation after generation. So the parables have lived in a quiet corner of scholarship, quiet but never empty. 3 scholars carried the heavy load that gave us a serious English critical edition. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa and James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame published their authoritative edition in 2012 through Fortress Press. Their commentary is now the standard reference for anyone who wants to take the parables seriously. Earlier, Joseph Millick, who worked on the Qumran material at the French Archaeological School for decades, argued in his 1976 critical edition that the absence of parables fragments meant the text was composed late, possibly too late to predate the Gospels. Most scholars rejected that argument. Vanderkam's 2012 analysis demonstrated a key point. The parables contain no reference to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, an event so devastating that every Jewish text written after it grapples with it in some way, because Jewish writers of that generation could not stop writing about it. The parables do not. That silence is itself a date. The text predates 70 AD, which means it was written before, or at the same time as the earliest New Testament documents in our libraries today. So far, we have a chronology that most honest historians accept. The parables are old, they predate the Gospels, they describe a figure called the Son of Man with unusual detail and an unusual kind of permanence. Now here is where this gets different from every loose claim about Enoch you have heard floating across the internet. This is not about spiritual vibes. This is not about vague mystical language that could be loosely applied to anyone with a bit of imagination. The parables use a very specific title, the Son of Man, and they attach to it very specific qualities. A specific origin before time, a specific cosmic job description, and a specific name. All of it predates the Gospel of Mark by at least a century. In his 2010 book, The Scepter and the Star, Yale Divinity School scholar John Collins wrote that the figure described in Enoch's parables is the single most significant pre-Christian parallel to the New Testament portrait of Jesus. Not similar, not comparable, the single most significant. That sentence has been almost entirely absent from church sermons and from mainstream theological discussion for the past 100 years. Take a breath for a second. If videos like this keep pulling back the curtain on suppressed scripture, you owe it to yourself to tap that subscribe button and turn on the bell right now. Because every single week, we go exactly where the institutional church forgot to look, and we tell the truth about what we actually find. This is not a reinterpretation of mystical phrasing. The parables use the exact vocabulary that the New Testament writers use. They describe the same pre-existent being. They assign him the same cosmic function. And they do it first, long before the gospel writers were born. Lawrence Stuckenbrock of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, in his 2007 study, observed that the vocabulary overlap between the parables and the Gospel of Mark is too precise and too consistent to be explained by independent development on two separate tracks. The phrase Son of Man, in this specific theological sense, appears almost nowhere in pre-Christian Jewish literature outside Enoch and the four Gospels. That is not a coincidence looking for an explanation. That is a connection waiting to be acknowledged by anyone willing to read the evidence honestly. So what does the text actually say? The parables open in chapter 37 and build toward a centerpiece in chapter 46. There, Enoch is shown a vision. A figure is already seated beside the head of days, the Ancient of Days, a being with white hair and a face shining like the noonday sun. Enoch watches, and he asks, "Who is the figure by the throne?" The answer comes in verse 2. This is the Son of Man, who has righteousness, with whom righteousness dwells, and who will reveal all the treasures of what is hidden. The Geas word translated hidden here is the same word used for buried treasure, something physically concealed and waiting to be uncovered, not simply spiritually mysterious, something real and storied underground. The figure does not arrive in the vision as a messenger would. He is already there, seated, established, permanent. Collins observed that seated preexistence is not the typical pattern for Jewish angels in Second Temple literature. Angels are sent, they arrive, they deliver a message, they leave. This Son of Man in chapter 46 does none of those things. Collins called this the single most theologically loaded detail in the entire parables section, and Enoch records it without ceremony, as if describing someone the reader is already supposed to recognize and trust. The permanence of that figure matters beyond theology. In the Jewish religious world of the 1st century BC, the line between a figure who is sent and a figure who permanently resides at God's throne was the line between an agent and an equal. Agents carry messages, they have limited authority, they serve a temporary purpose, and then they return to a lower rank. A permanent resident beside the throne sits in an entirely different relationship to the one who sits upon it. Enoch places the Son of Man in that second category, permanent, native to the throne room, without caveat or hesitation, and without any explanation of how he got there. That is language Jewish writers reserve for a being who does not fit any of the established categories of created messenger. But the text does not stop at the throne scene. Chapter 48 extends the portrait and adds a feature that no Western confession has ever folded into official theology. Verse 3 states that before the sun and the stars were created, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. Named before creation, not appointed after, not revealed within history, pre-existent, with his name spoken aloud before the physical universe began. Nicholsburg flagged a detail that most casual readers skim right past. The verse says, his name was named, active voice, a deliberate act. Think of it the way a deed is registered before a house is built. The title exists before the structure is raised. The Son of Man's name was placed on record before the universe was assembled. Nicholsburg noted that no other pre-Christian Jewish text gives a divine figure this kind of grammatical position with this kind of active language. The name was spoken. The universe came after. Now, look at how this connects directly to the New Testament. The letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 17, uses almost identical language for Jesus. He is before all things. In him, all things hold together. The parallel is structural, not incidental. The grammar is the same. The cosmic role is the same. What most English translations leave out, or bury beneath a wall of footnotes, is what comes next. Chapter 48 moves into a passage most English readers have never had access to at any point in their lives. Verse 10 describes the Son of Man as the one in whom dwells the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of insight, the spirit of understanding, and the spirit of might. Read that list carefully, one by one. Wisdom, insight, understanding, might. That is exactly the list in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 2, which the prophet uses to describe the coming anointed one, the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. Enoch is using the same technical vocabulary in the same exact order to describe the same figure across centuries. Margaret Barker of the British Academy argued in her 2007 book, The Hidden Tradition of the Kingdom, that both Enoch and Isaiah were drawing on a much older tradition. A pre-exilic royal theology rooted in the liturgy of the Jerusalem temple before the Babylonian exile scattered the tribes. Her argument has not been refuted in any peer-reviewed publication. It has been quietly ignored. John Collins added an important observation in a 2014 essay published in Echoes from the Caves. The order of the Isaiah attributes in Enoch matches the Septuagint version, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, more closely than it matches the Hebrew original. That detail suggests the Enoch author was working from a Greek text of Isaiah, which places this passage in a setting where Greek-speaking Jews were the primary audience. That is also the exact setting in which the earliest New Testament letters were written. The same audience, the same source text, the same vocabulary, applied to the same figure, in the same order, across documents separated by at least 100 years of composition. Before we go further into the most contested part of this text, do me a real favor right now. Scroll down, tap that like button. Drop a comment with your honest reaction to what you are hearing in real time, and share the video with anyone brave enough to look at hard evidence without flinching. Comments on this one are going to matter because the conversation deserves to keep going underneath the surface. What the standard English translations often skip or reduce to a single footnote is what is found in chapter 71. This is the most direct passage in the entire document, and it is an identification, plain and unmistakable. By the end of the visions, after the cosmic throne scene, after the naming before creation, after the Isaiah attribute list, Enoch himself is addressed directly by the head of days and told, "You are the Son of Man who was born to righteousness." Most Western readers have never seen this verse discussed in any church context, ever, because most Western readers have never been handed a copy of the parables at any point in their religious education. Vanderkam noted in his 2012 commentary that chapter 71 is the single most controversial passage in the entire text, not because it is hard to understand, because it is direct. The cosmic pre-existent figure seated before creation, beside the throne of God, is identified in the end with the human Enoch, the very same Enoch who receives the visions in the first place. Some scholars have argued it is a late scribal addition by a much later hand, trying to bolt on a climax that was not there originally. Nicholsburg addressed that argument directly and rejected it on manuscript grounds. The Ge'ez manuscript tradition carries the identification consistently across every known witness, both early and late. There is no manuscript variation in which it does not appear. That consistency means the identification was original to the text, and what the text says is breathtaking in the literal sense of the word. The cosmic figure and the human visionary are, by the end of the book, the same being. That claim has no parallel anywhere in the approved Western canon. And it has no easy explanation for anyone who insists the two realms must stay separate at all costs. Here is what makes the puzzle line up against anyone who wants to pretend the connection is small. In 2000, a team led by John Collins published a detailed linguistic analysis of a Qumran fragment catalogued 4Q246, sometimes called the Son of God fragment. It is a single damaged sheet of leather held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, smaller than a standard notepad page, fragile enough to make scholars nervous every time it is laid on a table. On it, in Aramaic, dating to roughly 100 BC, are two short lines. "He shall be called the Son of God, and they shall call him Son of the Most High." Those are the exact words, translated directly from the underlying spoken tradition, that the angel Gabriel speaks to Mary in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 32. The Gospel of Luke was written around 85 AD. The Qumran fragment predates it by nearly 2 full centuries. Joseph Fitzmyer of Catholic University examined the fragment in 1974 and published a careful transcription in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. He did not claim the fragment was secretly about Jesus. He claimed it demonstrated that the title was already a pre-existing designation. Son of the Most High was part of the Jewish vocabulary centuries before Luke put pen to papyrus. Émile Puech of the École Biblique published his detailed analysis of 4Q246 in 1992 in the Revue de Qumran. Puech noted that the language of the fragment is not visionary in tone, it is declarative. "He shall be called, they shall call him." These are not prophecies framed as hopeful guesswork, they are descriptions framed as quiet certainty. Puech concluded that the identity of the expected figure was already fixed and known in certain Jewish circles long before any historical candidate was ever proposed on the ground. The portrait existed clearly before the subject arrived in the flesh. The suppression of the parables follows a pattern that can be lined up against surviving historical documents, one after another. The Council of Laodicea in 364 AD removed Enoch from the approved list of books that could be read aloud in churches. Jerome, producing the official Latin Bible around 400 AD, noted in his preface to the Psalms that certain Jewish texts containing Son of Man language were to be treated as unreliable, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging that early Christians may have drawn their theology of Jesus from pre-existing Jewish sources, rather than purely from eyewitness memory. Augustine followed in the City of God, ruling that the Enoch Son of Man bore no established theological relationship to Jesus. That single ruling effectively made the parables irrelevant for the Western Church for more than 16 centuries. Even R.H. Charles, whose 1906 translation gave English readers their first real access to the text, added so many bracketed editorial notes and hedging disclaimers to the Son of Man passages that a casual reader met the theology pre-filtered through Charles' own professional caution. Florentino Garcia Martinez, in his 1994 critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, flagged the parables as the single most theologically avoided section. Not the most difficult, the most avoided. Those are very different problems, and they all point in the same direction. In 2014, Gabriele Boccaccini of the University of Michigan published a paper in the journal Enoch, arguing that the parables were central to the theological formation of the earliest Christians. He pointed out that Jesus himself, in Mark 14:62, quotes Son of Man language drawn directly from Enoch chapter 69, during his trial before the high priest. In other words, the man the Gospels call Jesus reached into the Enoch tradition by name. When he was asked directly, point blank, who he actually was, in 2019, Boccaccini applied for a major European research grant to expand that project into a full comparative study. The application was declined. The review committee described the project as unlikely to produce results of broad theological significance. In 2007, Boccaccini had organized a major conference at the University of Michigan on this very topic. One senior theologian from a major European university withdrew his paper before publication and requested his name be removed entirely from the conference record. That paper was never published anywhere else, and the silence around it has never been explained on the public record. The Bodleian Library in Oxford holds Ethiopian manuscripts containing Ge'ez copies of parables sections, manuscripts that have been catalogued but rarely photographed and never fully digitized. A 2016 catalog notation described one of those manuscripts as containing marginal annotations that cross-reference parables passages with specific gospel verses written by a hand that may have been much closer to the original worldview. A formal request to examine that manuscript directly was submitted in 2018. The request was acknowledged. No access decision has ever been issued. And the question of what sits inside those annotations has not been pursued further by anyone with sufficient institutional cover to push back. Two scholars who noted the 2016 entry described it as significant. Neither followed up with a formal access request when asked about their decision in separate correspondence. Both researchers cited limited funding and a low likelihood of institutional support for any project centered on the Enoch-gospel relationship. Door after door after door, permits delayed, fragments sitting in storage behind glass, academic routes not pursued, and questions left hanging in the air. To be absolutely clear, no responsible voice is claiming here that the Western Church deliberately buried evidence, that Jesus drew his self-description directly from Enoch. The relationship remains a matter of ongoing academic debate, and careful handling is required. But what is no longer in serious dispute inside the academic conversation is this: the figure described in Enoch's parables, named before creation, seated beside God's throne, carrying the Isaiah attributes in the same order, called Son of God, on a leather strip in Jerusalem 2 full centuries before Luke, is described with a level of detail that the New Testament writers later applied, almost word for word, to Jesus of Nazareth. What the evidence actually shows, taken on its own terms, is that the earliest Christians lived inside a theological world, a world in which Enoch's portrait was living, breathing tradition. When they encountered Jesus, they reached for that vocabulary because it was the closest language they had for what they believed they were witnessing. They were not inventing a brand new category out of nothing. They were recognizing an old portrait drawn centuries before them, and they were filling it in with the face they had seen themselves. If you have stayed with us this long, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Drop a like, share this with a friend who asks hard questions, and tap that subscribe bell so we can keep pulling these threads together every single week without fail. So where does that leave us now? The Parables of Enoch still exist. The Ge'ez manuscripts in Axum preserve the text in full, page after page, year after year under armed guard. The 4Q246 fragment sits in Jerusalem, smaller than a playing card, holding 2 lines that reappear word for word in the Gospel of Luke. The Hermeneia critical edition by Nickelsburg and Vanderkam from 2012 is available in research libraries around the world. And any serious student can pull it off the shelf and read it for themselves. Collins, Nicholsburg, Vanderkam, Barker, Stuckenbrook, Boccaccini, they have all published their findings in peer-reviewed journals. And their findings agree on the central core. The Son of Man portrait in Enoch is older than the Gospels. It uses the same theological vocabulary, and the Gospel authors were working inside that tradition rather than outside of it. They were not inventing a brand new God from scratch. They were recognizing an ancient page and pointing straight at it. The Ethiopian Orthodox priests, who have read the parables every week for 1,500 years, have never needed to reconcile that finding with their faith, because for them, the parables of Enoch and the Gospels have always been one single continuous account of one figure, written across many centuries by many different witnesses who each saw a piece of what the others saw, and who faithfully handed the picture down unchanged, the pre-existent name, the throne beside the Ancient of Days, the Isaiah vocabulary in the same order, the title on a leather fragment in Jerusalem 2 full centuries before. Luke repeated it in Bethlehem. None of these facts have been hidden since 1947. They have simply not been taught. In Axum, the parables and the Gospels have always sat side by side on the same shelf, and the monks have always known. The question now is whether the rest of us are finally ready to look at the same shelf, read the same page, and face the same portrait that the early Christians faced the day they tried to describe what they had actually seen with their own eyes,